Broadcast, it's taking the world by storm. People are cutting the cord to their high cable bills and moving away from streaming services like Netflix, Hulu, and others for something better. Q Broadcast. For just $60 a month, you'll get access to every channel you could ever want, including HBO, Cinemax, and Stars. And the best part? There are no contracts, no hidden fees, and you're free to cancel anytime. With Q Broadcast, you can enjoy streaming live TV, movies, and top series on up to 5 devices at once. Whether you're at home or on the go, Q Broadcast makes sure your entertainment is always at your fingertips. Imagine being able to watch all your favorite channels from anywhere, anytime, without any restrictions. We're talking about thousands of movies, hundreds of TV series, and a huge library of live channels, all in one place. And don't forget video on demand and pay-per-view events. Those are included at no extra cost, so you'll never miss a big event again. Now, take a second and think about your current cable bill. You're probably paying anywhere between $100 and $300 every month, locked into long-term contracts and hit with surprise rate increases. With Q Broadcast, that's a thing of the past. It's just $60 a month. No contracts, no extra fees, no hidden costs, and no price hikes. Why juggle multiple subscriptions like Netflix, Hulu, and cable when Q Broadcast gives you everything you need in one convenient package? People everywhere are switching to Q Broadcast, saving money and getting more content than ever before. So, what are you waiting for? Click the link in the description and sign up for Q Broadcast today. Just $60 a month, no contracts, no hidden fees. It's time to take control of your entertainment and start streaming smarter.
We live in a world where men are told it's harmless. It's just entertainment. But let's stop lying to ourselves. Pornography destroys. It weakens your spirit. It dulls your drive. And it robs you of what real intimacy is supposed to be. Every click is a step away from the man you're supposed to be. We can't call ourselves leaders if we are slaves to a screen.
As someone that is prior service, I know all about discipline. And discipline isn't out there, it's within your mind. Porn rewires your brain, weakens your will, wrecks all of your relationships. It doesn't just stay on a screen, it invades your marriage, your confidence, and your actual purpose. As men, if we don't learn to discipline ourselves, we'll be ruled by our impulses. Now, it is time to stand up and take control before this silent war takes more than you're willing to lose.
Real men don't hide in the shadows of shame. We step up and we protect what's ours. We fight for our wives and kids, our own hearts. Twitter isn't just an app, it's a weapon. It's a tool used to break free and start living like the man that you're meant to be. The battle's here and it starts with you. You can stop living in shame and you can break free today.
Here at the Anomic Age, we know that these times of uncertainty are stressful. It is incumbent upon all of us to put our fears first and bow down to government tyranny. Gone are the days of freely leaving your home, working, and social interactions. In exchange for safety, we will trade liberty. At the Anomic Age, we understand. However, just in case you want to get off your knees and stop being a sniveling coward, check out the John Age Project at anomicage.com.
Meet Ann Morrissey, who is here with her daughter, Dareth. Dareth is 17 years old. Mrs. Morrissey, I don't have to tell you that most parents would be extremely depressed if their daughter came home one day looking like this. I assume that was your response shock, anger, depression? What was it?
I was extremely angry. I really went bananas.
Yeah, how old was she when this happened?
Possibly 13, 14 years old.
We're talking like it's a disease, isn't it?
Well,
Yeah. How did she explain it to you, Mrs. Morrison?
there was very poor communication until we went into counseling. And it almost broke up our family. But through counseling and Serena, I can understand it better.
What do you understand?
That she feels like she doesn't want to be like everyone else, and she wants to be her own person. And through the dress code and her lifestyle, she's expressing this. It doesn't conform with our rules, but we're learning to cope, and it's a very, very difficult thing. Extremely difficult.
Dareth, let's let you talk for yourself. You're from Long Beach, California.
I just can't handle being like everybody else because that's what everybody else wants, you know. Just because somebody else does something does not mean that I have to do it. You know, I have my own morals and ideals, and I go by them.
Are you drug-free, Dareth?
Yes, I am.
Is this a political statement, then? Do you have some misgiving about the society that you see?
Yeah, there's a lot of problems, you know. A lot of the people are really aware of what's going on, you know, and I don't like it, you know. There's a lot of problems. I don't like the way society is based.
What bothers you? Give us some of the misgivings you have.
The rich, the poor, the people starving, the wars, you know. Why can't, you know, everybody just get along and just live their life?
You know something is wrong, and it's time to stand up. You are listening to The John Age Show.
Trust no one. Trust no one. Trust no one.
You found it. You're here. You're headlong down the runaway train that is the Anomic Age, and I am your host, John Age. Happy to be back with you once again in the not-so-wee hours of the PM. AnomicAge.com is where you can find all things me. Please like all the likes, subscribe to all the subscriptions. If you're looking at the homepage there now, you'll see that our guest is none other than Mr. Michael Williams. He'll be getting to all things Beatlemania, Tavistock Institute, and culture creation. But before we get into that, please check out AnomicAge.com, like all the likes, subscribe to all the subscriptions, share those links, friends, family, loved ones, and enemies. iPhone app, Android app, free newsletter, subscribe by email, link. So much there right there on the homepage of AnomicAge.com. If you can't handle the full 1-hour edition with guests, I recommend the information breakdown segments. They're only about 30 minutes, and they cover a variety of topics. So, without further ado, Mike Williams is a critical thinker and host of the popular internet site Sage of Quay. That's going to be sageofquay.com, Quay.com, Sage of Quay. He is also the founder of his long-running alternative news blog, Sage of Quay. Mike's content is dedicated to awakening the masses to help bring humanity back into our national existence of living in truth and serving creation. Thank you so much, Mike, for being with us today, sir. It's a pleasure. I'm happy to have you on.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thank you for asking me to come on your show.
Oh, it's definitely wonderful to have you on. And, I was talking with a guest a few weeks back who sort of mentioned your name, and I'd already found you by searching his name. So Jay Widener, he was on a long time ago, and I found your content with him, and beautiful how these things work out sometimes.
Yeah, there's that synchronicity thing, right?
Indeed, the synchronicity, absolutely. Well, there's so much to get into with your research with the Beatles, and it connects into what I've kind of done a lot of shows about in the past. I'd say a few weeks, but honestly, a few years. I've sort of come back to this notion of culture creation and how much of our quote unquote culture is legitimate grassroots. This just happened sort of natural thing. But the more you sort of start picking at this thing and looking into these various avenues, the more, unfortunately, you find that so much of this has been contrived, manipulated, or at least somewhat controlled by something. And the Beatles, I think, being one of those big ones that is such an iconic band. So many musicians from various genres will point back to them as saying that was so influential, and this album and that album and so forth. So I understand why so many folks have this resonance towards, I'd hate to go there, but in that quest for the truth, I think we got to go there.
Yeah, it's a tough pill to swallow, John, for so many folks, especially people that are my age. We grew up with the Beatles. And so for most of my life, I was a Beatle fanatic. And it was because of the Beatles that I got into music. I learned to play guitar, write songs, record, and all that stuff. So in 2016, when I came upon a book titled The Memoirs of Billy Shears, which was published, well, the first edition was published back in 2009, and I read that book, I was having a difficult time getting my head wrapped around what the book was saying. And it had a number of threads going through the book. The first one primarily being that biological Paul McCartney, the guy that we knew between 1962 and 1966, was replaced in late 1966. The book states that he actually passed away on September 11th of 66. And he was swapped out with Billy Shears. Mm-hmm. And I refer to him as Billy Shears because that's the name he gives us. He introduces us to himself on the Sgt. Pepper album. Even though Ringo sings the song is actually introducing the new band member to the world. So we had that piece of it where we had Paul McCartney, biological Paul, being swapped out, but then we have this whole other thread, John, which is what you touched on in the intro, which is that the Beatles were a monstrous social engineering initiative, and they were created in a construct of Tavistock. And so that was the piece that really looms larger and larger as you get into the conspiracy. In fact, I stopped calling it the Paul is dead conspiracy. Going back a number of years ago, I went to the McCartney conspiracy, and then it's the Beatles conspiracy, because the whole swapping out of biological Paul McCartney at the end of the day is just a subset.
Yeah, just a piece of the puzzle.
It's a sidebar piece of the puzzle, exactly. And so there's a much larger play at hand that is very important for people to understand, because it's as you mentioned, they are, when I say they, we're talking about the controllers, we're talking about Tavistock, the Committee of 300, the Rockefeller Foundation, all of them, Bilderberg, Trilateral, Davos. They are knee-deep in transforming our culture and our society. And the stake I put in the ground, John, is 1960, because it's a nice round number. Mm-hmm. And what I tell folks is, for the last 6 decades, there has been a very methodical and incremental march toward a new world or a one world agenda. And I would argue, and I'm sure you would too, that it's no longer a slow march today.
No.
Now, I mean, they have picked up the pace. They've put the pedal to the metal, and they're looking to make change very, very quickly. But for the first 60 years, up through around 2020, then March 2020, we have the event That's where the pace really, really picked up. So, yeah, it's all about the transformation of culture. And as you mentioned, very little of the culture that we exist in and we interact in on a daily basis is organic, because they have created so much of what's all around us and what it is that we're plugged into, that it's their system that we're operating in, and their system is loaded up with deception.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's funny that you put that demarcation at 1960, because that's pretty much where I put it as well, and I'm sure other people also. But so much happened between that point and where we are today. I mean, I've done shows on this stuff where you look at the no-fault divorce laws, introduction of the pill, drugs, legitimization of drug culture, Watergate, what am I leaving out? Abortion.
Yeah.
Another undeclared war with Vietnam rolls us into the Middle East. And I mean, we could just keep checking these boxes off. But so much of that was out of the culture that I would argue, and probably you as well, that was just created at 1960 from so on to where we are today. It was just, I mean, you look at the 50s and there was a little bit of harbingers of things to come with Elvis and Jerry Lee Lewis and Sun Records. But then you hit 1960 and it just sort of really goes downhill, snowball effect, if you will, to where we are today.
Yeah, because 1960 was the beginning of their age of Aquarius, or their their eon of Horus. And so that's when they buckled down, and they decided that it was going to be a straight march toward their goal line, which is to achieve their age of Aquarius, or their version of it, I should say, which is the eon of Horus. It's Aleister Crowley's eon of Horus. And all the things that you rattled off. And one of the most significant events, John, that took place goes back to the Kennedy assassination.
Yeah, I left that one
in
out.
1963. That was a huge, huge turning point, especially with regard to the American psyche. Mm-hmm. Because at that point, when Kennedy was elected president, there was a lot of upbeat. There was a lot of hope. There was a lot of people were filled with inspiration that things were really going to take off for the country. And then when Kennedy was assassinated, that was popping the bubble, a big bubble. And when you take a look at what's happened since the Kennedy assassination on November 22nd of 1963, as you mentioned, there's just a litany of events that have taken place. And these are all things that they control. We talk about political events, military, medical, the education system. I mean, we could just go on and on and on. These are all part of the internationalist apparatus that controls the world. We used to call it the shadow government, the deep state. I mean, today they're front and center. They make no, they're not hiding anymore. We could see the World Economic Forum is out there front and center talking about all the things that they want to do. And so, yep.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get off on too much of a jag, but absolutely the trauma-based mind control. And I know Naomi Klein did a whole book, The Shock Doctrine. And I think for so many people, the shock and that trauma-based mind control kind of began with that JFK assassination, and then rolled into RFK, MLK, and John Lennon, and attempt on Reagan, and 9/11. It just keeps on with more and more trauma. But for so many people, the images on the television screen in the JFK assassination really burned and seared into their psyches and really changed, like you said, a whole generation of people. I mean, my parents and grandparents, everyone in that generation always went back to that moment and said, well, that's kind of when it all changed. All thought, all trust in government, all legitimacy of anything was just sort of put into question with that one event.
Yeah, in fact, I remember I was only 4 years old in 1963, and I remember very clearly watching the television set. It's seared in my memory, some of the events that took place when it was televised. So I was only 4. So when we talk about how it can affect, how it's trauma-based, and it has a lingering effect, it definitely leaves an impression And if I was only 4 and I remember it, then people who were much older than I was are going to have a much greater recollection of that day, and it could potentially have more of an impact to them emotionally and mentally going forward.
And then if you put these pieces together again, you're looking at JFK in 63, and then by 64, we're at the helm of what they term the British invasion, with the Rolling Stones, the Beatles being that cornerstone band of that, and many others to follow.
Yeah, exactly. So the reason why I brought the JFK piece into it is because it was a major event. That's number one.
Absolutely.
But number two, the Beatles were a logical step from a mind control perspective to go from the JFK assassination to this wonderful thing referred to as Beatlemania.
Escapism.
Right, escapism. So it took a country, because when the Beatles came to America on February 7th of 1964, it was referred to as the Beatles conquering America.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They pick and choose their words very, they have meaning. You know, you just can't schlep it off and say, well, it doesn't mean anything. There's intention behind their words. And so when the Beatles arrived, it was right off the heels of the Kennedy assassination, and that's part of the perpetual state of trauma-based mind control and conditioning that takes place in the world.
Yes, no doubt. So a lot of the things that are sort of questioning or causes consternation to people when we talk about the Beatles is, you know, they sort of just rose out of nowhere, seemingly. And a lot of people will draw those comparisons with the occult, rightfully so, as far as meeting at the crossroads. And you've heard of all these different bands and entertainers, I'll just say, selling their souls and all these sort of things. So I think that's one of the major sticking points with the Beatles is they seem to come out of nowhere. They didn't really pay their dues, I think, in a lot of people's eyes of working their way up from a small club to Shea Stadium. Is that accurate?
Well, a lot of people will say, based upon the official narrative, that, oh, they paid their dues because they did Hamburg and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to put it within context, John. They arrived to do their first gigs in Hamburg in August of 1960. They then landed in America, as I mentioned before, to conquer America on February 7th, 1964. That's only 3.5 years.
Mm-hmm.
So they went from obscurity in August of 1960 to a trajectory that was just amazing, to landing in America in February of 64. And if you go back and take a listen to, and this is what I do, I use mainstream information, interviews, and sources to show people that they're telling you, it's hidden in plain sight, but they are telling you how this really worked. So the Beatles, when they first started in August of 1960, per George Martin's own words, and George Martin was their producer and many times referred to as the fifth Beatle, that he thought their music was rubbish and he didn't see any songwriting abilities. Like he didn't see any songwriting acumen coming out of the Beatles, out of John Lennon and Paul McCartney.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, at the time in 1962, when he met them and then ended up signing them, George Martin was a big-time producer, and he would know if he ran across a group or an artist that had ability, songwriting ability, and he didn't see it. So they went from being these young guys in Hamburg with no songwriting abilities, and also with marginal at best musical abilities as far as how good or how well versed they were on their instruments, again, to winding up with the start of Beatlemania in America, at least in February of 64. So you have to ask yourself, how did that trajectory happen? Was this organic? Did four guys that were bouncing around in Germany, who at the time were living in squalor and playing 7 or 8 hours a night? I mean, there's an interview by Pete Best where Pete says that they would be at the venue at 6 p.m. They would play for 7 or 8 hours. They would then go to sleep, and they would wake up at 3 p.m. in the afternoon and have to be back at the venue by 6 p.m. So that left a window of 3 hours between when they woke up and when they had to be back at the club in Hamburg. Mm-hmm. So the first question you've got to ask yourself is, who was writing music at that time? Nobody was writing music at that time. And in fact, the Beatles were just a group of 4 guys, young guys, that were doing what 4 young guys would normally do, who were in a band away from home in Germany, in Hamburg, which, the area that they were in was really, it was like the red light district. There was a lot of prostitution. There were bars all over the place. So, they were in an environment where what wound up happening was the Beatles kind of embraced that environment as 4 young guys in a band.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't want to go there, or they don't know about that piece of the history, because when you talk about it that way, then it doesn't put them in this propped up, illuminated light in which most people see the Beatles, as these creative, prolific, genius songwriters, especially when we're talking about John Lennon and Paul McCartney. So there was a lot of stuff that went on, John, between August of 1960 to the time they made their way over to America in February of 1964. They did a Decca demo January of 1962, and Decca declined to sign them. They weren't impressed. And then when George Martin first met them, tapes were given to him by Brian Epstein, and George Martin said, not interested, not going to sign them. And then in the Memoirs of Billy Shears, the book I mentioned earlier, it tells us that George Martin was overruled. In other words, he received a call from a superior, whether it be at EMI itself or within the corporate structure of Freemasonry, and said, look, you're going to take him on. And from that point on, George Martin, I refer to him as the managing director of the Beatles' psychological operation, this social engineering initiative, was responsible for making the Beatles what they became.
Yeah.
And that includes employing outside songwriters that were on the Tavistock/EMI payroll to write the songs. And also they hired session musicians to record the songs. So from 1962 through 1966, the Beatles, I will say, wrote very little, if anything. I lean toward nothing in that period, because all the songs were written by outside songwriters or ghostwriters, and the songs were recorded by session players. I have an interview. I'm working on a presentation as we speak, and there was an interview that John Lennon and Paul McCartney did back in August of 1966, and it was the same day that they released their 7th album, Revolver. And then in that interview, Paul McCartney states that they were limited as a group and not all that good musically. And so you have to ask yourself, at that point, when we're talking about Revolver in August of 1966, for one of the main songwriters of the greatest band, what many people consider to be the greatest rock band of all time, to state in an interview that they were limited as a group and not all that good musically, well, that flies in the face of the picture of what the official narrative wants to present to the public, that they were prolific geniuses, musical geniuses. So, it's one of those situations where you have to ask yourself, it was a truth bomb, yes. Was it revelation of the method? Possibly. So it's a very interesting story, John. When you get away from the official narrative and you start digging into what was really going on, it becomes very, very interesting.
And I think a lot of people don't want to view it through that lens. I think it goes back to sort of our belief that it all just happened. But if you look at the music industry as an industry, that's what it is. These big corporations want whoever the public view of it really doesn't matter. They want whoever the person that can sell their product the best. That's the bottom line. Whether they're selling candy bars or a song, They want that best face forward, and they'll sort of fill in the blanks with the musicians, the songwriters, the stage, the lights. It's all a show, folks. It really is all a show. And it's really the bottom line is money, but in this instance, I think it's sort of multifold. It's that Russian doll sort of one thing and the other, because it's not just money. It's about the control. It's about culture creation, the evolution of the counterculture that came out of the 1960s. It's so much rolled into this one thing. It's not just a grassroots thing. I mean, just to keep hitting that point home.
Yeah, well, the social scientists, they play on human emotions, right? Mm-hmm. And who doesn't like the official narrative's version of the Beatles story? Yeah. Organic, four lads from Liverpool. They connect with a record store owner. They get signed by a major label under the tutelage of George Martin, and they become this brilliant band, and they achieve unparalleled fame and fortune. It's a great story. I call it the Cinderella story. It's a great story. Who doesn't want to like that story? But this is what the social scientists at within Tavistock, within the controlling apparatus, this is what they do. They play on what they know people want to hear, how they want to feel. And then they present a narrative that matches up with what they know people will buy, what they will just absorb and take in. But to your point, and you're absolutely right, the music industry, the entertainment industry is a business. And not only is it a business, it is one of the most ruthless businesses to operate within, because everything is about money. Everything is about a product and getting the best product out the door. So it's naive for people to believe that these record companies are going to spend their time jerking around with a bunch of musicians and artists and bands that are not going to bang out as efficiently and as effectively as possible the product that the record company or the label needs to get out the door. It's just not going to happen. So what are they going to do? They're going to do what every company does. They're going to tap the best resources and skills to bring forth the best product. So they're going to tap their best songwriters, ghostwriters that they have on tap. They're going to bring in the best studio players that they can get their hands on to get these songs recorded and to get them as near to perfection as they possibly can. And I tell people, I try to explain to them, the Beatles were not an exception to the rule. They were not. This is how the music industry works. And what I recommend to folks is there are 3 documentaries that anybody who's interested in this particular conspiracy and the music industry in general and how it works is watch The Wrecking Crew. The Wrecking Crew were a collective of musicians that recorded on an enormous number of pop music recordings, albums and singles from the 1960s and 1970s, LA-based, although they were also in New York and extended out to other areas of the country, but mostly LA-based. Watch the Wrecking Crew documentary if you really want to understand how the music industry worked in the 1960s and 1970s, and you'll understand. Also, there's another documentary that came out in 2013 titled Muscle Shoals. And Muscle Shoals was doing the same thing that the Wrecking Crew was doing, but they were doing it in Alabama. And then if you really want to understand how the music industry works from 1980 going forward to current day, the documentary Hired Gun, I recommend. So those 3 documentaries, The Wrecking Crew, Muscle Shoals, and Hired Gun. And so it's another situation, John, where the documentaries themselves are revealing the truth about how it all works. And what always blows my mind is I have people that will take my suggestion and watch the documentaries and then say, yeah, but it doesn't apply to the Beatles or it doesn't apply to the Rolling Stones.
They've got sacred cows no matter what.
Yeah. So, and of course we have Bernard Purdie. Bernard is one of the greatest studio and session drummers of all time. He came out in the late 1970s and said that he drummed on 21 Beatles songs. He was hired by Brian Epstein to fix the tracks. And Bernard has not come off that story in over 45 years. In fact, he released a book. I think his book was released in 2014. It was titled Let the Drums Speak, and he dedicated an entire chapter to the Ringo Starr controversy or the Ringo Starr conspiracy, and it had to do with Bernard coming out and saying that he drummed on 21 Beatle tracks. Mm-hmm. I had a source of mine who was related to, I say was because Ronnie Verrill passed away a number of years ago, to Ronnie Verrill, who was another great session drummer in the UK. And this person came forth and they wrote me. They had been writing me for a while. And after I released my big presentation in April of 2020, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music? This person wrote me and said, Mike, now that the cat is out of the bag, my relative, Ronnie, also drummed on Beatles songs. So now we have Bernard Purdy and we have Ronnie Verrill drumming on Beatles songs. The official narrative tells us Andy White drummed on Beatles songs because George Martin, the producer, hired Andy to play on P.S. I Love You and Love Me Do on the 1962 recordings. And I've argued that I don't believe George Martin hired Andy White to drum on just two songs. I think Andy White was a go-to drummer that George Martin used whenever he was doing studio recordings. And Bernard Purdy ultimately came out in the early 2000s in an interview and said there were four drummers on the Beatles' music, and I believe Bernard was referring to the early period, 1962 to 1966. He said there were four drummers on the songs, and Ringo was not one of them.
Wow. So
there you go. So I'm just giving some folks some of the background, to what it is that I've gotten into and the stuff that I presented. But, like I said, it's a wild story. It really is.
One aspect I wanted to touch on, and I think it makes perfect sense to me anyway, is this sort of metamorphosis process that you see. I would say starting with the Beatles, but you see that through so much of music, whether or not you're talking the Beatles, Miley Cyrus, Michael Jackson, just about anybody big name in the music industry seems to go through this metamorphosis, especially the Disney people. But I mean, I'll put that aside for a moment, where they came out on Ed Sullivan. I remember they just came off this Hamburg red light district. So they were not the clean-cut boys, if you believe the narrative. They were not the clean-cut boys that they were put up on Ed Sullivan with their proper suits and hair, and everything was just perfect. And then you juxtapose that 10 years down the road to the heavily influenced by psychedelics, heavily pushing the drug culture, all sorts of Indian influence, the beards, the longer hair. And they seem to have gone through this metamorphosis. Again, I'll say, just like you see so much of the big acts go through for generations now, multiple decades, we're seeing the same sort of trajectory. And I know some people are going to chalk it up, well, they grew older and they grew up and things changed, but it seems to be such a dichotomy of just polarization, like clean-cut boys to, yes, free love, free sex, let's do it all, maybe a little Satanism on the side,
Yeah. So a lot of people will say, well, they just evolved as it went along, but that's not what happened. Yes, there was an evolution, but it was not an organic evolution. The evolution of the Beatles and other bands and other artists and entertainers is determined by the social scientists. So in the case of the Beatles, it's Tavistock. So they had to start the Beatles at a certain point where they were going to be accepted by the culture and the society at that point in time. So they couldn't show up in 1967 psychedelic garb in 1962. Mm-hmm. They would just be set aside. Nobody would pay any attention to them. So the way the social engineering works is they start at a point where there's a broad or as broad of an acceptance as they can possibly muster up at that point in time. And then people get acclimated. And then you get bombarded and deluged with the music. And now what's happening is that evolution that we're talking about starts to get more and more traction. And so what happens is a little more change is introduced. And then people accept that. And then a little more. And then that's accepted. So it's that incremental, methodical approach to change. They're not just going to hit people over the head with a hammer and say, well, this is what we're going to do now. No, they know that people require a period of acclimation. The masses do. And that's how it's done. And they do it, like you said, John, pick an artist. Pick any artist that is front and center, that is popular in pop culture, and you will see that metamorphosis. You will see that change take place where they started at point A, and then if you go 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line, or maybe 10 years down the line, if they have a longer shelf life, you see a very different artist than what you were looking at 5 to 10 years prior.
Mm-hmm. And oftentimes they do what I just call, they burn their operatives. They put them in such a horrible situation or cast them in such a bad light. It sort of destroys their career or their trajectory. And either they fade into obscurity, or in 10 years they show up on a golden oldies tour of, they've resurrected them once again, and here they prop them up and they're back again. It seems to be that same sort of thing.
Well, I think what they do, and I'm pretty sure I'm correct, is they identify the usefulness or the shelf life of a particular artist, entertainer, or celebrity. And there are going to be those that are going to be long-term. Mm-hmm. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Who, and so on. But then you're going to have the other categories of players, artists, and entertainers and celebrities that are not going to have that elongated shelf life. So they're going to serve a particular purpose at a particular time. And then once their usefulness has expired, they're tossed aside. Mm-hmm. That's why, a lot of them are just abused. They're abused through mind control. They're abused with alcohol and drugs. And this is why when we take a look at the music industry, just take a step back and think about all the stories of all of the bands and the artists that have suffered, where their lives were ended prematurely, or they had to dig themselves out of a drug-induced or alcohol-induced hole by going to rehab and all of this stuff. That industry is ripe with that dark stuff.
And sort of I would say perhaps the collateral damage of this is that it infuses that and normalizes it within the culture. So yes. Other upcoming musicians are going to say, well, hey, Jimi Hendrix died and Jim Morrison died. They all died these tragic young deaths. I got to go down the same road in order to produce that same vibrant music, which I don't know if all that's true, considering you got the Wrecking Crew, you got just probably other organizations we don't even know about. I've heard sort of similar accounts of Motown Records with Barry Gorey sort of having these same sound crews, basically just pushing these artists out there, creating that beautiful Temptations bass line and all these lyrics that we like so much.
Absolutely. So the artists are just the veneer. There's an entire machine that is behind the curtain to prop up the artists and that veneer. And the average person doesn't see what's behind the curtain. It's like trying to see if the Great Oz is behind the curtain. You pierce the veil. So most people, they don't do that. They just take it at face value. They believe the stories that are put out about how brilliant these songwriters are, these bands are, and all that stuff. And they have no idea how the industry really works. And you also, John, you hit on a good point, and you're right in the sense that what they do is they glorify a depraved way of existence, mm-hmm. where sex, drugs, and rock and roll. We've all heard that. Sex and drugs and rock and roll. And so many young people buy into that because it's glorified, and they think it's cool, and they think it's a way in which to conduct yourself, and you're going to get ahead. When the truth of the matter is, it's just a way to break down society. It's just a way to dismantle the culture and societal values of a society that had traditional values and looked at things in a much different way, in a much different light, going back to prior to 1960, because we put that stake in the ground. But that's what it's really all about. It's to implant in people's heads that that's okay when it's really not okay. But by you thinking it's okay, you're actually further enabling their agenda to destroy the culture and to destroy society. Mm-hmm. And so many people, they don't get it.
And with the Beatles especially, I know this occurred a little bit with Elvis also, and it went on throughout his career, but with the Beatles, it's the first time that I saw just this complete insanity with screaming people and people passing out. And I think it sort of followed that same trajectory I was talking about with the mob mentality or the groupthink. So once they see people do it, whether or not these are actors, paid for provocateurs, or legitimate, it becomes this trope of, okay, well, this is what you do. You show up and you scream and you pass out and you throw panties on the stage and act like a total nut. And now that's just the norm. But if you turn back the clock with the Beatles, that was kind of the first time we saw that. And then that ushered in that new age of contrived rock stars, provocateurs, paid screamers. I mean, whatever you want to call it, it does seem to have been a big change point there with just the crowd and the group thing.
Well, the Beatles, when it started with all of that screaming and the girls and all, that was contrived. It was a construct of Tavistock. In the very beginning, these girls were paid. They would bust in and they were paid to do all the screaming. And then what they did was they would use their trickery as far as their photography and their cameras, and they would shoot at certain angles and close the frame so it looked like there was a lot of people there. And, so they went through all of that. But Tavistock and the controlling apparatus, but in particular Tavistock, because this is their line of business, their understanding of the human mind goes beyond most people's level of comprehension. So they know that humans have this uncanny knack to follow, to mirror, to imitate. So to your point, when all of this screaming was taking place, Tavistock knew that, hey, in the beginning we have to seed this with some money. Mm-hmm. But in short order, we're not going to have to spend any money, because once we get the thing going, people are just going to behave that way because that's how the person next to them is behaving, or that is the way to behave when you're at a Beatles show or you're at some concert. That's the way that you're supposed to conduct yourself. And it's manipulation. It's manipulation of people's minds because, like I said, they know exactly how people are going to react once they're shown a certain behavior.
Mm-hmm. It's that old monkey see, monkey do thing. They start seeing this as, oh, well, that's what you do. I mean, it's the same cues that a baby picks up on from their parents and their greater social group. It's crazy.
Or it's just with any type of fad that even takes place, John, right? When we talk about clothing.
Yes.
All of a sudden, clothing just shows up, a certain type of clothing. This happened to me when I was younger with the bell bottoms and the psychedelic stuff and all that stuff in the 1960s. Where did that stuff come from? Was that organic? No, it gets introduced through the media. And now what's happened is now you have an entire population of people, especially in Western culture, who are wearing bell bottoms and psychedelic types of clothing and wearing their hair longer, growing beards and mustaches and all that stuff. It's all contrived.
And with the Beatles, I think a lot of people look at them with the Eastern mysticism and the esoteric. But to your point and to your research, Paul McCartney being replaced could, and I would probably assume was, a bit of a ritual, a bit of a sacrifice, if you will, that you see, again, played out in so many different bands and groups over the decades. But I think that could be one of those first early sacrifices. Probably not on par with the halftime show this past year, but it was the 1960s more covert sacrifice.
Well, in the memoirs of Billy Shears, it strongly alludes to biological Paul McCartney. When I refer to biological Paul McCartney, this is the Paul McCartney from 1962 through 66. Of course, he was there before 62, but I'm talking about when the Beatles had hit their point where they were leading into fame and being famous. So that would be 62 through 66. It tells us that McCartney and John Lennon entered into a Faustian bargain in October of 1963. So a Faustian bargain is a deal with the devil.
Yeah.
Or as Bob Dylan would refer, it's a deal with the chief commander. And so what the controllers did, if that is true, and my personal opinion, Jay and I talked about this, these rituals take place. Okay, a lot of people don't want to hear it. They don't like to think about it. They want to pretend it doesn't happen. But there's a lot of dark stuff that happens in this reality, folks. And as I mentioned, the music industry and the entertainment industry itself is ruthless, and it is very dark. So, the Beatles were prepped leading into their first album, which was released on March 22nd, 322, Skull and Bones, also Genesis 322. Please Please Me was released, and they got a taste of fame and fortune. They got a taste for success. And then in October of that same year, 1963, that's when they entered into the deal. And what I try to explain to folks is, John Lennon and Paul McCartney at that time were two very young guys. Paul was 21 and I think John was 23. And they didn't know what they were getting into. But they went through whatever the ritual is comprised of, whatever the ceremony is, they went through it. And right after that, everything really took off. Then they released their second album with the Beatles on November 22nd of 1963. So think of the dates. March 22nd, Skull and Bones. Mm-hmm. And then November 22nd of 1963 was the exact day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated.
Wow.
Okay? So the Beatles as an entity are immersed in the occult. And so it's very possible that biological Paul McCartney was his death, if we are to believe that he died in September of 1966, September 11th, was a result of entering into that Faustian bargain. So we can look to the 27 Club for people that are familiar with early deaths of rock stars and entertainers. But just take a look at some of the other bands during the Beatles' time. We have Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones passes away. Mm-hmm. We have Keith Moon of The Who passes away. John Bonham of Led Zeppelin passes away. And we can go on and on and on. So the whole bit about entering into these pacts with Satan, with Lucifer, with the devil, whatever label you want to give this entity, I believe these things are real. Going to the crossroads. Mm-hmm. That's what it's referred to. So if we go back into the early part of the 1900s, we could look at Robert Johnson, who was a famous blues guitarist. And that's really when we talk about going to the crossroads, Robert Johnson is typically used as a starting point, even though I'm sure it wasn't. But from a music perspective, from a blues perspective, it goes back to the Robert Johnson story. But yet, so I believe the rituals, John, are real. And is it likely that John and Paul entered into some kind of pact? I would say that is also likely, because that's what takes place in the music industry and entertainment. If you want to achieve real fame and fortune, I mean, big time stuff, mm-hmm. You're going to have to kiss the ring. And Bob Dylan, in his interview going back to, I think it was the early 2000s, with Ed Bradley from 60 Minutes, talks about the deal he made with the chief commander.
Yep.
Who do we think he was talking about? So this stuff goes on, and it's dark. But, I look at it this way, John. Some people don't want to hear it because it scares them. But knowledge is power. And the only way we're going to be able to dig ourselves out of this ditch that we're in worldwide is we have to have that knowledge base. We have to understand how the entities, the people, the organizations that are attempting to suppress humanity and keep us from being enlightened, you have to understand how they operate. What's their game plan? So anyway, I know I went off a little bit on a
that's perfect
tangent there, but yeah.
And the Aleister Crowley information, I always found disturbing, because if you look at the history of Aleister Crowley and all the dark stuff he did, and then you sort of look at how did he play so prominently in the Beatles, in Led Zeppelin, and so many of these bands from that era, because even now he's an obscure figure that most people don't care about, haven't heard of. And I would say, especially if you look at the 1960s, I mean, there wasn't internet access. You couldn't just Google Aleister Crowley and figure this stuff out. I mean, he was a mystic from decades prior. How in the world did he play so prominently in so many of these bands if there wasn't, in fact, that occult influence, that occult connection? And then you got to look at the individuals in the bands. I mean, these folks were just, if you believe the narrative, just working class blokes from jolly old England. So how did they just happen to have all this bizarre esoteric knowledge,
Right. So the thing with Crowley is he was very well known, and I shouldn't say is very well known within the inner circle of the elite power structure, or what I refer to as the pyramid of power. Mm-hmm. In fact, his religion of Thelema, do as thou wilt, is the spiritual belief system and the philosophy, the religion of a majority of those that reside within the pyramid of power. Yeah. And Crowley was very, very well connected into the elite power structure. And he was working for British intelligence going back to World War I, and he was an accomplished occultist. And it was in his religion of Thelema, he talks about the eon of Isis, the eon of Osiris. The eon of Osiris would equate to the Piscean age, and the eon of Horus. And Crowley taught that the eon of Osiris, which was, we can, like I said, loosely equate with the Piscean age, was an age where humans were oppressed and unenlightened, and they were shackled. So unless something changed, that's how humanity was going to exist. They were going to exist in an oppressed, shackled way.
Yeah. And
his eon of Horus was an eon of enlightenment, and because Horus being the savior figure, like Krishna, Vishnu, Jesus, and so on, would bring humanity into a new age. The problem with this that I have talked about is that I have folks that will email me and say, well, that's not a bad thing, Mike. He's talking about unshackling humanity, and I think, well, here's the thing, though. He's not talking to you.
Yeah.
His religion of Thelema. See, some people will say that Luciferianism doesn't have any holy texts. It doesn't have a doctrine, if you will. There's nothing written down. And my argument is, I don't think that that's true. I believe Crowley's religion of Thelema is the doctrine of current day Luciferianism. As Crowley is known as the modern day father of modern Satanism and Luciferianism. In Crowley's book 77, he has a whole litany of things that says that man, per his will, can do all of these things unencumbered, without anybody interfering. And then at the very end, he says, and if anybody, and I'm paraphrasing here, folks, if anybody should interfere, you can kill them. You can take them out if they get in your way. If they get in the way of you achieving your will, you can get rid of them. And then right below that, he says, all the rest, all the others, will be our slaves. That's from his book 77. So, when I was researching him, and I read book 77, I thought to myself, well, you know what? He's not talking to me. He's not talking to you. He's not talking to the audience. He's talking to the initiates and the adepts and the followers who are in the congregation of Thelema/Luciferianism. That's who he's speaking to.
Yeah.
And more specifically, he's talking to those who are in the elite power system, the power structure. So for those who are Thelemites out there that are just, the average Joe, Joe Smith out there, he's not even talking to you. It's to me, it's a system where they're looking to clearly break away from the rest of humanity, eliminate as many as they possibly can in the process. And for those who are able to cross the bridge and wind up on the other side with them, you're going to be in a role where you're a slave. You're going to be subservient to them and their system. And so a big piece of Crowley, goes back to the Eastern religions. And he himself, it all goes back to the Egyptian mysteries. And what I have said, what I have presented to my audience, John, is that the controllers are Egyptian mystery fundamentalists.
Yeah.
They're Egyptian mystery zealots. And that's their religion. And so they're imposing their religious philosophy and their principles on us. So if we go back to Crowley, they're imposing their will on us. Do as thou wilt. And in my opinion, that's what's going on right now. And because it's based in occultism, we're going through a process of ritual. We're going through a process of alchemy. So the breaking down of culture, the breaking down of society is an alchemical process. This is how they think, and this is how they operate. Nothing they do, this is what folks have to understand, nothing they do is natural or organic. It's all contrived and constructed. And in their twisted minds, they believe that they can push the natural order out of the way to accomplish their goals. And this is why, when we take a look at what's going on today in our world, it's all upside down. It's like a comic book. It's like we live in a cartoon. And it's because they're going about this in an inorganic, alchemical way in which they're trying to bypass the natural order.
That's absolute fact.
Yep.
And
since I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I know this is going to shatter everybody's image of the Beatles, but I saw this sort of comparison while we were talking. It's kind of like a grooming. It's like the Pied Piper groomers that the Beatles, first showed up after this big trauma as this age of, it's going to be okay. And so we begin to trust these fine folks from Liverpool with their nice suits and their cute little hair. And then before you know it, they've groomed you into,
right.
Oh, well, you know what? You could be doing this. It's so sick when you think about it and compare it to pedophiles or some fruitcake in a van trying to get your kid in a compromising position. But that's kind of what they did. They groomed you into accepting this. And before you know it, well, you've done this. You've had all this, drugs, psychedelics, sex, drugs, rock and roll, that whole trope. And then before you know it, a couple generations, that's just infused into the American mindset and culture. And you don't even realize we were groomed into accepting this alchemical Faustian pact for like the whole generation, it seems.
Right. And I should also mention that in the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, Billy alludes very, very strongly. There's nothing concrete and definitive, but it alludes to it very strongly, that his father is Aleister Crowley. Wow. His biological father. So Billy Shears is the guy that replaced Paul McCartney, biological Paul McCartney. And so now Crowley his thing was sex matching. And I suspect, along with my colleagues, my fellow researchers, that Billy is the result of sex magic. And children who are conceived from the act or ritual of sex magic are identified immediately for very important roles, influential roles in life later on as they progress in their life. So we believe that it's possible, very possible, that Billy was conceived via a sex magic ritual that Aleister Crowley engaged in, and Billy was the child that was born from that ritual. And I know it sounds crazy, folks. You know, I'm telling you, I get into this research, and there are times when I have to take a step back and I think to myself, this is really unbelievable. Mm-hmm. You know, but once you really understand what really goes on behind the curtain, in fact, I would suggest people read Daniel Esterlin's book on Tavistock.
Yeah,
that'll make your eyes cross about what Tavistock is actually involved in. People just think mind control is about hypnosis. That is not what it's just all about. And the reach of Tavistock, how it has subverted just about everything in our society, especially when we're talking about politics, we're talking about the military, we're talking about the corporatocracy. They've got their hands into everything. And, you know, it's a very powerful organization. So I recommend folks read that book. It's going to be, for a lot of people, a shocker when they read it. But like I said, it's better to know the truth than to walk around naive and ignorant.
Man, that is so true.
Know?
Well, I hate to say it, but we're almost out of time, and we got to talk more about this, because I'll try to run this by with you off the air, but there's so many connections today that just sort of sprang to mind. I've always wanted to talk to somebody about the punk industry. You mentioned the Aleister Crowley book 77, going right into 1977 with the rise of the Sex Pistols. And I spoke with John Waters, who was a journalist in Ireland and covered a lot of the early music scene there in the late 70s, 80s. And we sort of got off on a jag on exactly what we're talking about today, but I've never had that full conversation on the punk industry. I want to talk about that maybe off the air a little bit, but I have a feeling that this connects.
Yeah, it connects. I'm not an expert on the punk genre, but I will say this. We talk about the number 77. Think in terms, folks, of Flight 77 during 9/11 and the London 7/7 bombings.
Man.
Okay? So part of their occultism, a very big piece of it, is numbers. And I tell my audience they paint by the numbers. Everything is encoded. Signs and symbols rule the world. And that's another thing that a lot of people have a hard time getting their arms wrapped around. They just think numbers are just numbers. It's just something you do when you're at the cash register at the supermarket, you know? No, it's a language within itself. It's a hidden language. It's an occulted language. And that's how they communicate out to each other. That's one of the ways, I should say, that they communicate out to each other. So, but Aleister Crowley, John, I know we have to wrap up here, is very important to everything that's going on right now, as difficult and as hard as it might be for some people to believe that. You have to really understand who the guy was and what his principles and his tenets and his religion of Thelema are all about, and understand his eons, and then you'll see how it all ties together and how it's all interconnected.
And it is dark, folks. The darker it gets, the further down you go. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Mike. Where can people find and support you? I know we got your website up on the screen there, but how else can they support and follow you?
Okay, well, if I didn't scare you,
I think we're into it.
You can go to my hub website. It's Sage of Quay, SAGEOFQUAY, sageofquay.com. And it's one-stop shop. All of my links are there. The links to, all of my Beatle research, my main YouTube channel where I did a lot of work that had nothing to do with the Beatles, and also my music because, as I mentioned to John before I started, I'm also a musician. So everything is there.
All right. Well, thank you so much. If you'll stick around for about 30 seconds, I'll talk to you off the air here in a minute.
Very good. Thanks, John.
Right. Thank you, sir. Folks, we barely got our feet wet in this, but if you missed any of it, anomicage.com is where you're going to be able to find today's episode in its entirety. The MP3, if you just want to listen to it in the car, going to the gym, taking a walk, what have you, and definitely the video version if you'd like to curl up on the couch, nice cup of tea, and really get into some of this stuff because It's mind-blowing for sure. As I always say, you can't do everything, but you can do something. So please try to get out there and do your part. Until next time, I'll be seeing you sooner than later in the Anomic Age.
Thank you for listening to The Anomic Age, a John Age project. For past shows, further info, and to comment, go to anomicage.com. That's ANOMICAGE.com. Till next time, thank you for listening to The Anomic Age.
Thank you.